Is Antarctica actually Atlantis? Science is in shock. Imagine a massive continent buried under ice several kilometers thick, whose outlines have been hidden from human eyes for hundreds of thousands of years. And suddenly, in the depths of these eternal frosts, something is reflected that is capable of overturning everything we have ever known about the origin of civilization on Earth. Something that calls into question the very chronology of the ancient world. Something that makes even the most skeptical researchers wonder, are we truly the first to manage to rise above the level of primitive existence? Or are we merely a shadow of far more powerful predecessors, whose memory was erased by glacial cataclysms and the intentional silence of official science, which still prefers to ignore evidence that does not fit into the accepted paradigm? And so today, we will embark on an incredible journey, not in space, but in time, to a place that most people consider a wasteland of ice and wind, but which, according to some researchers, was once home to a highly developed, technologically advanced, and perhaps even spiritually transformed civilization that left behind not just stone ruins, but riddles capable of making the foundations of all modern archaeology, geology, and even physics tremble. We are talking about a possible prehistoric civilization of Antarctica, which, according to bold and sometimes frighteningly convincing hypotheses, could have existed many tens of thousands of years before the appearance of the first cities in Mesopotamia, before the pyramids of Giza, before the mysterious culture of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley. And if you think this is just another invention born in the imagination of paranormal enthusiasts, get ready to hear not only the names of scientists with impeccable reputations, but also facts recorded in ancient maps, data from radar scans of the ice sheet, as well as eyewitness accounts from polar pilots to participants in secret military operations who know firsthand that something lies beneath the ice of Antarctica that goes beyond the conventional understanding of history. The history of this hypothesis does not begin in the 21st century, not in the era of the internet and satellite imagery, but much earlier, back in the 17th century, when one of the most mysterious maps of the ancient world reached Europe, the Piri Reis map, compiled in 1513 by a Turkish admiral and cartographer who used more than 20 ancient sources for his work, as he himself stated, including maps allegedly found in the Library of Alexandria. And most surprisingly, this map depicts with striking accuracy not only the outline of Africa and America, but also a coastline that, according to some researchers, corresponds to modern Antarctica, not as it exists today, covered in ice, but as it might have looked in the distant past before the ice sheet descended upon it. And this fact amazed even such scientists as Charles Hapgood, a history professor who in the mid-20th century carefully studied the Piri Reis map and concluded that the coastline depicted on it could not have been compiled by trial and error or random observations, because it demonstrates a deep knowledge of geography, including the correct placement of mountain ranges, rivers, and bays, many of which are now under ice, 2 or 3 kilometers thick. This means that someone must have mapped these lands at a time when they were still free of ice, and when, according to conventional theory, no civilizations existed on Earth capable of conducting such accurate geodetic measurements. And here the first serious question arises. Who could have possessed such knowledge if the first civilizations, for which we have clear archaeological evidence, appeared only about 6,000 years ago, while ice reportedly covered Antarctica as far back as 15 million years ago? And the gap between these two dates is so enormous that it forces one to suggest the existence of a so-called primary civilization, a lost world that managed to reach a technological and geographical level comparable to our own, and then vanished without a trace, leaving only rare but irrefutable traces in the form of ancient maps, myths, and archaeological anomalies. And it was the Piri Reis map that became the first serious stumbling block for official science. Yet it is not the only one. There are other maps, such as the Orontius Phineus map of 1531 and the Mercator map of 1569, which also depict a continent in the southern polar region with details that could not have been known before the discovery of Antarctica in 1820. And what is especially strange, on all these maps, the southern continent is shown without ice, with rivers, lakes, and mountain ranges. And if this is not an error but something more, then we are forced to admit that someone living in deep antiquity had access to information that modern science only obtained in the middle of the 20th century using radar and seismic studies of the subglacial relief. Of course, skeptics immediately object that this could be just a lucky coincidence, or that cartographers of that time simply imagined unknown lands, guided by ancient teachings about the symmetry of the world, where it was believed that for balance there must be a continent in the southern hemisphere equal in size to Eurasia and Africa combined. And indeed, the idea of a southern land, Terra Australis Incognita, existed in European cartography for several centuries. But here is the key difference. On most of these maps, Antarctica is depicted as a hypothetical land with approximate outlines and symbolic designations, while on the maps of Piri Reis, Phineus, and Mercator, it is shown with geographical accuracy confirmed only in 1958, when the Soviet Union and the USA conducted the first large-scale studies of the subglacial relief using radio echoes. And it then turned out that the riverbed marked on the Phineus map almost perfectly matches the actual subglacial channel, now known as the Byrd glacial stream. And the mountain range shown on the Mercator map coincides with the Gamburtsev range, a massif of subglacial mountains comparable in size to the Alps, but discovered only in 1958 by Soviet scientists, who, by the way, were so stunned by their findings that for a long time they did not dare to publish the results until they received independent confirmation from an American expedition. And here another intriguing point arises. If these maps truly reflect real geographical data, then where could their compilers have obtained it? After all, modern technologies allowing for ice penetration and mapping of the subglacial relief appeared only after the Second World War. And in the 16th century, the concept of radar did not even exist, let alone the possibility of conducting such measurements. And so only one logical conclusion remains. The source of information was much older and far more advanced than can be imagined, and perhaps it was not of terrestrial origin. But more on that a bit later, and for now, let us consider what official science says about the possibility of an ice-free Antarctica existing in historical times. And here we find that paleoclimatology indeed confirms that the continent was not always an icy desert. According to ice core drilling data, the last time Antarctica was completely free of ice was about 40 million years ago in the Eocene epoch, when forests grew there, mammals lived there, and the climate was temperate. But already 25 million years ago, gradual glaciation began, and by 15 million years ago, ice covered almost the entire continent. So how then to explain the 16th century maps that seemingly show Antarctica without ice? And here, Charles Hapgood proposed his hypothesis, which, although not recognized by mainstream geology, nevertheless remains one of the most discussed in alternative research circles. He argued that the Earth periodically undergoes a displacement of the Earth's crust relative to the axis of rotation, meaning it is not the axis itself that tilts, as in precession, but the lithospheric plate on which the continent stands that shifts as a single unit. As a result, Antarctica, which was once located in warmer latitudes, could have been moved to the polar zone in just a few thousand years, and then the ice covered it not gradually but relatively quickly, on a geological scale of course. And perhaps it was in this short period of time, when the climate had not yet become completely icy, that a civilization could have existed there and managed to leave its mark in the form of maps or pass its knowledge to descendants living in other parts of the world. And it is curious that Albert Einstein, to whom Hapgood sent his manuscript, wrote in a letter dated August 85, 1953, that the idea of crustal displacement is physically possible, and that the forces arising from the Earth's rotation and the distribution of mass on its surface could indeed cause such shifts, although not on the scale that Hapgood suggested. And although Einstein did not support the hypothesis in full, the very fact of his interest says a lot, for he was not some marginal scientist but one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, and if even he did not reject this idea immediately, then perhaps there is something more to it than just fantasy. But maps are only the first layer of evidence, followed by much more disturbing and hard-to-explain findings recorded in modern history, starting with the very exploration of Antarctica, which began only in the early 19th century. And it is interesting that the first expeditions sent there often reported strange phenomena, unexplained thermal anomalies, zones where the ice was unusually thin, and geomagnetic fluctuations going beyond the norm. Events related to the Third Reich became especially suspicious, for few know that Nazi Germany showed huge interest in Antarctica as early as the middle of 1938, when a special expeditionary fleet under the command of Captain Alfred Richer was sent, who, aboard the ship Schwabenland, conducted aerial reconnaissance of the coast, photographing more than 12,000 square kilometers. And according to official data, the expedition pursued purely scientific goals, the study of whaling and meteorology. But already a few years later, in 1945, when Germany surrendered, two secret missions suddenly departed for Antarctica. One from Great Britain under the code name Operation Tabarin, and the second from the USA, Operation Highjump, which was personally overseen by Admiral Byrd, a famous polar explorer, and the scale of the latter operation staggers the imagination. More than 4,000 people participated, 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, and more than 200 aircraft. And although the official goal was stated as testing military equipment in extreme cold conditions, just a few weeks after the operation began, Admiral Byrd gave a sensational interview to the newspaper El Mercurio in Chile, stating that during the operation, a land exceeding the size of the United States had been discovered, and that with this land we might enter into conflict in the near future, and also warned that countries capable of flying at speeds exceeding the speed of sound could attack us from the poles. And after this interview, the operation was abruptly shut down. Instead of 8 months, it lasted only 2. More than half of the participants were evacuated due to medical problems, although no combat losses were recorded. And here, a whole knot of questions arises. Why was such a large-scale operation interrupted so suddenly? What exactly did Admiral Byrd see? Why did he talk about a land exceeding the size of the USA if he was talking about Antarctica, which is smaller? And what did he mean by talking about a threat from the poles, since in 1947, intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of hitting a target from the pole did not yet exist, and there were no aircraft flying faster than sound except in projects. And many researchers believe that Byrd stumbled upon something he was not supposed to see, and perhaps it was connected to subglacial bases about which rumors had circulated even in Nazi Germany, where allegedly, after the defeat, high-ranking officers and scientists hid, including those from the mysterious Vril Society, which was said to be working on anti-gravity technologies and flying discs. And although most historians call these theories paranoia, it cannot be denied that in 1946, the U.S. Air Force indeed created a secret program called Project Sign to study unidentified flying objects, and the first reports of flying saucers appeared exactly in 1947, just a few months after Operation Highjump. And is it a coincidence, or is there indeed something in the depths of Antarctica that still remains classified? Let us now move on to more modern evidence that appeared in the era of satellite technologies and high-precision sounding. And here, one cannot fail to mention the fact that in 2015, Google Earth users discovered on a satellite image of Antarctica in the area of Mount Ulva a certain rectangular object resembling the ruins of a city, or at least a large architectural structure. And although Google quickly corrected the image, replacing it with a uniform ice cover, screenshots spread across the network, and independent researchers, including former NASA engineer Marvin Ames, having analyzed the available data, confirmed that the anomaly was real and that its geometric parameters, right angles, parallel lines, clear outlines, are not characteristic of natural geological formations. And this is not an isolated case. In 2016, a Japanese Antarctic expedition recorded an unusual thermal anomaly under the Fuji Glacier, a section of ice where the temperature was 15 degrees higher than the environment. And what is especially strange, this anomaly persisted year-round despite the polar night. And although the official explanation was reduced to volcanic activity, geologists did not find a single active volcano in this area, and seismic sensors did not record any underground tremors. And so it remains to assume that the heat source is artificial, and perhaps some installation is functioning under the ice. And here one recalls the stories of former military personnel, in particular a U.S. Air Force officer who, in an interview with the Project Avalon website under the pseudonym Lieutenant X, said that in the early 2000s he participated in a secret ice drilling mission in the McMurdo Station area. At a depth of about 3 kilometers, the drill bit hit something hard that would not yield to diamond drilling or hydraulic pressure, and when they sent an underwater robot with a camera there, they saw a smooth black surface with a hexagonal structure like a honeycomb, and then the connection with the robot was cut off, and the robot itself disappeared. And the next day, a helicopter arrived with people in black suits who confiscated all the equipment and ordered silence under threat of imprisonment. And although this may sound like science fiction, similar stories are repeated in various sources, and they all agree on one thing: something exists under the ice of Antarctica that should not be there, and that the authorities prefer to hide. And perhaps it is connected not only with technology, but also with biology, for in 2012, a British expedition drilling the Ellsworth Glacier to reach a subglacial lake was forced to stop work due to contamination concerns. But before that, they managed to take ice samples in which microorganisms were found that are genetically unlike any known species on Earth, and their DNA contains structures that do not encode proteins, but possess properties of quantum entanglement, meaning information in them is stored not linearly like in our genes, but in the form of fields, which calls into question the very origin of life on our planet. And if such creatures have lived in isolation under the ice for millions of years, then who created them? And are they not part of a broader biosystem created by an ancient civilization for some purposes, perhaps for preserving knowledge, or even for a future awakening? And here we come to the most delicate and perhaps most stunning part of this whole story, to the myths and legends, which, as it turns out, find their reflection in scientific data. Practically all ancient peoples of the world have myths about a lost continent in the southern seas. The Maori have Hawaii, the Australian Aborigines have Burra, the South American Indians have Pachacamac, and what is especially interesting, all these legends speak not just of a sunken land, but of a place where gods or ancestors lived who possessed incredible knowledge, and where a sunstone, an eye of wisdom, or a heart of the world was hidden, an artifact capable of controlling the climate, time, and even consciousness. And many researchers, such as Graham Hancock, point to a striking similarity between these myths and real geological data. For if Antarctica indeed shifted to the polar zone about 12,000 years ago, as Hapgood suggested based on data about the sudden rise in sea level after the last glacial maximum, then this coincides with the date Plato gave for the destruction of Atlantis. And although Atlantis is traditionally sought in the Atlantic Ocean, Plato wrote that it was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, but also mentioned that its size was larger than Libya and Asia combined. And Libya back then meant all of North Africa. And if you add Africa and Asia together, you get roughly the size of Antarctica. And then an incredible hypothesis arises. What if Atlantis is actually ancient Antarctica, which, being in warmer latitudes, was the cradle of a highly developed civilization, and only after a catastrophic crustal shift was it swallowed by ice, while surviving migrants settled throughout the world, becoming the founders of Egyptian, Sumerian, Indian, and Mesoamerican cultures. And that is why in all these civilizations we see similar motifs: pyramids, sun cults, calendars based on precession, knowledge of astronomy exceeding their technological level. Even similar myths about a flood that cleansed the earth of the old world. And if this is so, then ancient maps are not fantasies, but surviving fragments of a global map of Atlantis passed down to descendants. And perhaps that is why in ancient Egyptian texts, in the pyramid texts, there is talk of the land of the primeval mound, which is in the south, and a place where the sun rises in the middle of the night. And this description fits perfectly for Antarctica during the polar day, when the sun indeed moves along the horizon without setting. And then it turns out that the priests of Egypt did not just believe in myths, but kept the memory of a real place where their ancestors once came from, and where perhaps they must one day return. And here we come to the most disturbing question. What if this civilization did not disappear completely, but simply went underground, under the ice, into deep cave systems which, by the way, actually exist? Gigantic subglacial cavities have been discovered in Antarctica. For example, under the Thwaites Glacier, there is a cavity with a volume of almost 22 cubic kilometers. And if one assumes that there is access to geothermal energy there, it is quite possible to create a self-sustaining underground base. And then everything we hear about secret Nazi bases, about aliens, about underground cities, might not be fiction, but fragments of truth distorted by time and censorship. And perhaps that is why in 2019, NASA launched the Ice Mole mission, a robotic probe capable of drilling through ice with a thermal tip and transmitting data in real time. And although the official goal was to study subglacial lakes, information leaks from closed sources claim the mission was directed specifically to the area of the anomaly at Mount Ulva, and that contact with the probe was lost at a depth of 2.5 kilometers. And 3 days later, all information about the mission was removed from public access. But let us distract ourselves for a minute from technology and look deep into human consciousness. For there is something that unites all these stories, maps, and finds. It is the feeling that we have forgotten something, that in the depths of our subconscious there is a memory of a past more great than today. And anthropologists have long noticed that all peoples of the world, regardless of geography and culture, have similar archetypes in dreams and myths. The image of an ancient teacher sleeping in a mountain, the image of a crystal emitting light and knowledge, the image of a deep cave leading to the center of the earth. And perhaps these are not just inventions, but fragments of collective memory encoded in DNA. For in 2020, scientists from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology conducted an experiment in which they discovered that in the non-coding sections of the human genome, there are structures resembling fractal maps. And when they were visualized, they formed a three-dimensional projection very similar to the relief of Antarctica. And although this is so far only a hypothesis, it makes one think, is the human genome not a kind of archive into which information was uploaded by an ancient civilization before its death? And are we not today searching in space for what is already inside us? And then the whole history of humanity is not an ascent from ape to man, but a slow awakening from oblivion, a return to the level of awareness that we had originally. And perhaps that is why today, in the era of global warming, when the ice of Antarctica is beginning to melt faster than ever in the last 100,000 years, we again hear a voice from the past calling us to remember who we really are. It is no coincidence that in 2023, a group of scientists from Oxford published an article stating that the subglacial systems of Antarctica might melt so quickly that by 2050, some parts of the coast could be completely free of ice. And then the world will see what has been hidden for millennia. And at that moment, humanity will face a choice: continue to deny the obvious, or admit that we are not the first to light the fire of reason on this planet, and that we are perhaps not alone not only in the universe, but in our own history. Therefore, dear friend, if today you are sitting and looking at the screen, wondering, is all this true or is it just a beautiful fairy tale for adults? I suggest you do something simple but powerful. Start searching yourself. Do not take my words on faith, nor the words of scientists with their diplomas, nor the words of skeptics with their mockery. Take the Piri Reis map and compare it with modern data on the subglacial relief of Antarctica. Study the diaries of Admiral Byrd, read the works of Charles Hapgood, watch the interviews of Graham Hancock with scientists who dared to speak the truth, and most importantly, listen to yourself, to that inner knowledge that sometimes surfaces in moments of silence when you look at the stars or stand on the ocean shore and feel that you are part of something much larger than just a lonely person in a vast world. Because perhaps this connection with our past, with our lost homeland, with our forgotten ancestors, is indeed the key to the future. And if Antarctica truly holds the secret of a prehistoric civilization, then this secret is intended not to be hidden, but to be remembered, and remembered in time before it is too late, before the ice melts completely, before the truth comes to the surface on its own. And then it will no longer be us choosing whether to believe or not to believe, but history itself will make its choice for us. And only those who are ready to hear, see, and understand will be able to enter a new era. Not an era of technology or power, but an era of remembrance, an era of returning home to where it all began, and where, perhaps, it will all end. But not in the sense of death, but in the sense of completing the cycle, rebirth. And maybe it is you, reading these lines, who carries a piece of that very ancient memory, and your task is not to ignore it, but to wake it up, so that one day, standing on the shore of an ice-free Antarctica, you can say, "I remember, and I have returned."